Next, we're going to turn to the article that is entitled, "Why is Silicon Valley So Awful to Women?" Uh, this is a long article, and as I wrote, I hope that you read roughly the first third of it and perhaps skim the remainder of it. I'm going to point out some highlights and comment on those highlights. And I'm going to start out by making my own summary from the article of some of the things that women experience far more than men in the technical workplace. And as I say these, I'd like you to start thinking, have you experienced those things? Whether you're male or female, have you experienced these types of behaviors in your own educational or working careers? So one of them is that a man, in this case, amazingly, a job applicant, was disrespectful to senior women who were interviewing him in a tech company and more respectful to junior male people who were interviewing him. A second one is, and this I'll say broadly, is that in a situation where you have technical men and women in a room, that somebody comes in, whether it's a colleague, a customer, a potential client, and they have technical questions and they direct them more to the men than to the women. A third one is that you're in meetings and with a group of men and women, and the people who speak up first and loudest are mainly the men, and the men interrupt the women when the women are speaking. And the fourth one is that somebody makes a comment that the diversity goals of that organization are simply lowering the standards of the organization. Actually, sorry, there's a couple more. One is that the women in the organization are steered more towards less technical jobs. Say they're encouraged to do a marketing job rather than a purely technical job. And then the last one that's mentioned in this article that was also part of our previous discussion is that women are propositioned on business trips or things that are maybe a layer down from that, but still terribly disturbing, such as inappropriate touching in various situations. So again, the question is, does any of that sound familiar to you? And if I could look at you, I'd be surprised if not every head was nodding. That is, I suspect that every one of you would be saying yes, whether it's in your educational situations or your workplace situations, that you've observed at least some of that. So, what are some simple or common sense but effective things that one can do about those sorts of behaviors? I'm just going to mention a few and a few from my own experience over the years. There's plenty more that could be said. One, since one of the examples was about interviews, is how one makes for fair interviewing situations. One of the key things there is to make sure that everybody is asked the same questions. Generally, you have a hiring committee that one actually scripts the questions so that there's fairness in what is asked, and that there's also fairness in what is not asked, that personal considerations that are not relevant to the job are not brought up in the interview. The second one I'm going to comment on is the dynamics we often find ourselves in meetings. This is something where I've had an awful lot of experience running meetings, and I can tell you that things can be effective. And in particularly, the person who is running the meeting, a situation that you'll certainly find yourself in as your career progresses, that person can make sure that everyone has a say. And often that requires you to think about who's made comments already, and at some point to say, rather than hearing from some of you who've talked already, I'd like to make sure that Jane and Lucy and George have an opportunity to say something because we haven't heard from them yet. That not only brings those people into the discussion, but it sets a dynamic for the group that has an impact going forward. That's actually the easier part. The harder part in my experience is to keep some people who always are kind of just pressing to say the next thing from dominating the meeting. One has to be polite about that, but one can also tell those people, you know, you've made a few comments, let's make sure we hear from some other people first. And then I think there's a bottom line here, and it gets talked about towards the end of this article if you get there. And that is, if an organization says that diversity is important, it has to include it in the way that evaluates people. For instance, if a manager is expected to contribute to the diversity goals of that company, then you need to have ways to manage that and to actually include that in the performance, salary, bonus reviews of that person. That really is a bottom line that comes out at the end of this article. If an organization is serious about the things that we're talking about here, then it has to be serious about them at the level of how it evaluates, promotes, and looks at people. The next article about what it's like to be a Black woman in tech is a shorter article, and actually an article from somebody who's just starting her tech career, and has interesting points to it. And so let me summarize just a few of those. One of them that she makes is that if one wants to achieve diversity, one generally needs to broaden the places and the ways that one looks for people. And in my experience, that's a really important point. There are a number of companies, particularly prestigious ones, that almost pride themselves on saying, we look at the top 10 schools or the top 20 schools or that type of thing. And that's really limiting. And I think most of us have had the experience that there are smart, talented, dedicated people in many different places. And if one is going to really diversify, one has to diversify the places where one looks. So I think that was a very important point in this article. A second one she makes is something I think is worth thinking about. She talks about choosing a place to work based on the empathy of that organization. How many of us do that? I don't know. Does that vary by gender, race, other things? I think it's dangerous to make generalizations that way. I think it's more important to just think that a lot of people are going to consider that. And if you're representing a company, you need to think about how your company genuinely looks on that type of a scale. The final one is the concept that she talks about of people from underrepresented groups being both hypervisible and invisible. I think that's a very important and clever thing to think about. The hypervisible is if you're the only one, then people are going to notice you more. And if you ever do anything that causes attention, perhaps negative attention, it's going to cause more of it. So that's a difficult place to be in. It's harder to make mistakes, and we all make mistakes if you're hypervisible. On the other hand, the invisible is not a literal invisible, but more an invisibility of the way you think of things. That some discussions that people have, that people may just not realize how those topics impact you differently than how they impact them. So I think that that whole concept is an interesting one to reflect on. I think in general, this article gives us some nice pointers about how we think about our organization and how we think about our colleagues. So when I was mapping out this lesson, I thought it was likely going to stop there. And literally a couple of days before I was preparing to record this, a new issue started surfacing, a new professional workplace issue that in many ways is the most relevant of any in this lesson, because it's about the actual practice of being a data scientist, and it's actually more on the technical side than on the how people are treating other people's side, although it's some of both. The issue is the departure of a woman named Dr. Timnit Gebru from Google, where she had been the co-lead of the ethical AI team. Now, I struggled with whether I should even include this here because it's really early. The issue and the information about this is just coming out. There seems to be more written every day. I'm sure there will be more in the days, months to come. And so it's really premature to try to make any judgments. But there's some facts that have come out that are so interesting for us to consider that I'm still going to include them here. I'm just going to try to summarize a few things that make this so interesting. First, background about the person who's involved. Gebru is a PhD computer scientist. Got her PhD from Stanford a few years ago, who's one of the very few Black women in AI. And in fact, as she noticed that herself, decided to co-found a conference that is called Black in AI. She's also made quite a reputation, including collaborating on some important work on facial recognition that we're going to see aspects of in the next module. Her collaborator is a woman named Joy Buolamwini from MIT. And by the way, while Gebru is a Black, originally African woman, whether her racial identity has anything to do with the issues, how they were handled by Google, is totally unclear. On the other hand, it certainly contributed to making it very prominent because it led to the departure of one of the very few Black leaders in AI from a prominent company, Google. Now, I'm using the word departure, I should say, because at this point, it's totally unclear whether this was a resignation, a forced departure, or some combination thereof. There's aspects of all of those there. What is more clear is what led to this incident, and that was simply something that happens all the time. A group of people, in this case it includes 7 researchers, I believe 4 of them were from Google, who were publishing or attempting to publish a paper in a conference. In this case, it was a paper about the risks of large language models, machine learning-based systems that are produced by Google and other companies. What happened is that it is common that companies will have a review process, and Google tried to either block or delay the publication of this paper. Gebru pushed back at that, and that led to the issues that have shown up in the media. What I'd actually like to concentrate on to conclude this are the technical issues that that paper contains, because they're very interesting in the context of this course. And apparently they're also the reason why Google had some concerns and why Gebru had concerns in return. The paper's not out yet, but the MIT Technology Review just released an article a few days ago that includes comments on an early draft of the paper. And it brings up 3 things that I'll highlight that the paper discusses from an ethical point of view. One, as you would expect, is the main thing one hears about in algorithms and data science, which is the concept of algorithmic bias. That's exactly what we'll be talking about in the entire next module. And basically, it's the point that in language recognition, as in other things, if the training data is biased or tilted in some way, then the outcomes that you get out of the model will be tilted in that way. And we'll be spending plenty of time on that. A second one is something that we'll refer to a little bit, although we won't really do justice to, which is the emerging concept of explainable AI. The fact that a number of these models, especially ones that use deep learning, have a way of getting from input data, training data, to be able to make conclusions without the user or society really understanding how they get there. And that leads to issues of its own, and the paper apparently talks about those. The third I found particularly interesting, and that is that the paper talked about the energy costs and the monetary costs of running these models. This is something the computing community is paying more attention to in general these days. And the point that it apparently made is that these are huge consumers of energy and monetary resources. Each of these 3 things, the algorithmic bias, the explainability, and the costs, are an ethical issue. The way that this was dealt with by the company and perhaps by the individual, we'll have to see, are potentially also ethical issues. Since the public understanding of this is just playing out, and as we saw, for instance, in that Uber case, the understanding of these things can play out over periods that take months and even years. It would be very premature to rush to any judgment, but it is timely to point this out as another instance of ethics in the professional workforce, and one that combines both the personal and the technical issues.